At exactly 2:07 in the morning, someone changed the locks on my front door. I know the exact time because I was standing in my kitchen, barefoot and shaking, staring at 3 strangers outside my house, while my husband's family stood behind them like they owned the place. For a few seconds, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The porch light was on. The street was silent, and yet there they were. My husband's older brother Marcus, his wife Elaine, my mother-in-law Patricia, and a locksmith I had never seen before. The locksmith was kneeling beside my front door. He was removing my lock. My lock. The one I had chosen when I bought the house. The one I had paid for. The one I had carried the keys to for almost 9 years. I ran toward the door. Stop. Everyone looked up. Marcus stood slowly. Go back inside. I stared at him. What are you doing? Changing the locks. I can see that. He folded his arms. You don't live here anymore. My heart seemed to stop. What? Patricia stepped forward. This house belongs to our family now. I laughed, not because it was funny, because sometimes something is so unbelievable that your brain doesn't know how else to react. This is my house. Marcus shook his head. No, it isn't. I looked at the locksmith. Sir, please stop. He looked uncomfortable. I was hired to change the locks. By who? He looked at Marcus. Marcus answered, by the owner. I pointed at myself. That's me. Patricia scoffed. You need to accept reality. I pulled out my phone. I'm calling the police. Marcus smiled. Go ahead. That smile frightened me more than anything else. Because he wasn't worried. Neither was Patricia. They weren't acting like people who had broken into someone's house. They were acting like people who believed they had every right to be there. I called. Then I stood there waiting. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The locksmith finished changing the front lock. Then he moved toward the side door. Don't touch another door, I said. Marcus stepped toward me. You've been warned. By who? By the family. I stared at him. The family. He nodded. You've had your chance. I looked at Patricia. What is this? She didn't answer. Then Elaine held up a folder. Everything is documented. I felt cold. What everything? She opened the folder. Inside were copies of papers I had never seen before. One of them appeared to show a transfer of ownership. My name was printed at the top, but the signature underneath wasn't mine. I stepped closer. What is this? Marcus said, proof that you transferred the house. I never transferred anything. You signed it? No. Patricia smiled. That's what everyone says when they're caught. My hands started shaking. I looked down at my phone. The police were still on their way. Then I noticed something. The house deed wasn't the only document in that folder. There was also a power of attorney, a bank statement, and a letter from an attorney, all carrying my name. None of them had been authorized by me. Suddenly, the situation became much bigger than a family argument. Someone had been preparing this for weeks, maybe months, and my husband's family had come to my house at 2 a.m. because they believed they had enough paperwork to make me leave. I looked at Marcus. Where is my husband? He smiled. He's not coming. That sentence hit me harder than everything else. Where is Daniel? Patricia finally spoke. He's with us. I stared at her. Why? She looked at the house. Because he knows the truth. The police sirens appeared in the distance. Blue lights reflected across my windows. The locksmith stopped moving. Marcus suddenly looked less confident, and then the police officer stepped out of the car. He walked toward us. He looked at the locksmith, then at Marcus, then at me. Who owns this property? I opened my mouth. But before I could answer, Marcus handed him the folder. Officer, this woman is refusing to leave a house she no longer owns. The officer looked at the paperwork, then at me, then back at the paperwork. His expression changed, and I knew that whatever he was about to discover, none of us were prepared for it. The officer introduced himself as Officer Reynolds. He asked everyone to step away from the door. Then he looked at me. Ma'am, do you have identification? I handed him my driver's license. He compared it with the name on the documents. Then he asked, do you have proof of ownership? Yes. I ran inside. For a moment, I was terrified. The new lock hadn't been installed on the back door yet. I went into my office, opened the filing cabinet, and pulled out the original property documents, the deed, the purchase agreement, the mortgage records, the closing documents, everything. I ran back outside. Officer Reynolds looked through them. His face became serious. Where did you get these? They're mine. How long have you owned this property? 9 years. A.M.My co-owner. Your husband? No. He looked toward Marcus. Does your brother have any ownership interest? Marcus shook his head. Not directly. Officer Reynolds frowned. Then why are you changing the locks? Marcus pointed at the folder. She transferred the property. The officer looked at the document. To whom? To my mother. Patricia stepped forward. I am the rightful owner. The officer looked at her. Do you have the original transfer documents? She handed him copies. He examined them. Then he asked, where is the original? With our attorney. Which attorney? She gave him a name. The officer wrote it down. Then he looked at me. Did you sign this? No. Are you saying your signature was forged? Yes. He looked at the document again. Then he asked, when did you last speak with your husband? I swallowed. Yesterday afternoon. Was there an argument? No. Did he tell you he planned to remove you from the house? No. The officer nodded. Then he turned to Marcus. Why did you come here at 2 a.m.? Marcus hesitated. We were instructed to secure the property. By whom? My mother. On whose authority? Marcus pointed toward Patricia. The officer looked at Mom. Patricia said, my son Daniel gave us permission. I stared at her. Daniel. She nodded. He signed the documents. I felt something inside me break. My husband. The man I had been married to for 11 years. The man who had kissed me goodnight less than 24 hours earlier. The man who had told me he loved me. He had supposedly authorized his family to take my house. Officer Reynolds asked, is Mr. Daniel here? Patricia said, Numbu. Where is he? Out of town. Can I speak to him? Isn't available. The officer looked at me. Do you have his number? I gave it to him. He called. Daniel didn't answer. He called again. Still nothing. Then the officer said something that changed the entire situation. Nobody is removing anyone from this house tonight. Marcus stepped forward. But officer, I said nobody. The locksmith quietly packed his tools. Patricia looked furious. This is a family matter. Officer Reynolds shook his head. Not if someone is presenting disputed property documents. Then he looked at me. Until ownership is legally established, you remain in possession. I almost cried from relief. But Officer Reynolds wasn't finished. He looked at the documents again. Something about this doesn't look right. What? He pointed at the transfer date. You're telling me you never signed this? Never. Where were you on this date? I thought. I was in another state. Officer Reynolds looked at me. Do you have proof? Yes. I had hotel records, flight records, credit card transactions. I had been attending a work conference nearly 500 miles away. I couldn't possibly have signed the document in the office listed on the transfer. Officer Reynolds stared at Marcus. Do you understand what this means? Marcus didn't answer. The officer looked at Patricia. She became pale. And then he said, this may not be a simple family dispute. That was the moment their confidence disappeared. But I still didn't know the most shocking part. Because the forged house transfer was only one piece of the plan. And by sunrise, I would discover why my husband had betrayed me. Daniel finally called at 60:18 in the morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table. I hadn't slept. Officer Reynolds had left hours earlier after taking copies of the documents. The locksmith was gone. Marcus and Patricia were gone. But the new lock was still on my front door. I answered. Where are you? Silence. Then, Claire, where are you? I'm sorry. Those two words told me everything. You knew. I didn't know it would happen like this. What did you know? He breathed heavily. Mum said you would agree eventually. Agree to what? The house. I closed my eyes. You tried to take my house. No. Then explain it. It's complicated. No, Daniel. It's very simple. I looked around my kitchen. Did you sign something giving your mother control over our property? Yes. I felt sick. Why? Because I thought we were going to sell it. Me and you. You never asked me. I thought you'd refuse. Because I would. He said nothing. I laughed bitterly. So you decided to forge documents instead? I didn't forge anything. Then who did? Silence. Daniel. I don't know. You don't know. My mother handled the paperwork. I stood. Where are you? I'm staying with my brother, Marcus? Yes. Why? Because things got complicated. I stared out the window. Daniel, did you know they were changing the locks? Another silence. Yes. That hurt. More than the documents, more than the lies. He knew. He knew they were coming. He knew they would change my locks, and he still let them come. How long have you been planning this? I don't know. How long? A few months. I sat down. Why? He whispered. I frowned. What debt? What? How much? He didn't answer. Daniel? Nearly $300,000. I felt dizzy. What? Our business. Business. He began explaining. Months earlier, Daniel had invested heavily in a business opportunity. It had failed. Then he borrowed money to cover the losses. Then he borrowed more money to cover those debts. Eventually, he had taken loans against assets he did not fully own, including, apparently, our house. But there was a problem. The house wasn't jointly owned, it was mine. I had purchased it before our marriage. Daniel knew that. He had always known. So he couldn't legally use it as collateral without my authorization. Unless he created the appearance that I had authorized it. I whispered. You tried to use my house to pay your debts. I thought I could fix everything. You almost lost my home. I was desperate. No. I shook my head. You weren't desperate. You were dishonest. He started crying. I didn't want to hurt you. But you did. I love you. Then why did you do this? He couldn't answer. And that's when I realized something. Daniel didn't make this decision alone. His family had been involved. They had all known. They had all believed I would eventually surrender. Because they had mistaken my kindness for weakness. And now I had one question. What exactly had they promised the people Daniel owed? The next morning, Laura, my attorney, arrived at the house. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, we need to see the debt documents. I don't have them. Daniel does. He's staying with his brother. Then we get them legally. She reviewed the property documents again. Then she noticed something I hadn't. What? She pointed at a page. Look at the date. I leaned closer. The document had been prepared 2 months before the night they changed the locks. That meant this wasn't a last-minute decision. It had been planned. Then Laura found another document. A loan agreement. The lender had apparently been told that Daniel and I jointly owned the house. But that wasn't true. The lender had been given a copy of the forged transfer. Laura looked at me. This could be serious. How serious? Your husband may have committed fraud. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to hear it. But I needed the truth. Can we save the house? How? Would challenge every document. Then she asked, do you know what Daniel's family planned to do with the house? No. She looked at the loan agreement. They weren't planning to keep it. What? They intended to sell it. I stared at her. Sell my house. Wes, for how much? She gave me the number. My stomach dropped. They had planned to sell my home for nearly twice what they needed to cover the debt. That meant they weren't simply trying to save Daniel. They were trying to make money. I asked, where would the extra money go? Laura looked at me. That's what we need to find out. We followed the documents. The buyer was a real estate company. The sale was already scheduled. The property had been listed privately. And someone had already paid a deposit. The entire thing had been moving forward without me knowing. I felt betrayed all over again. This wasn't about one bad decision. This was a coordinated plan. My husband, his mother, his brother, and possibly others. They had built a plan around the assumption that I would eventually disappear from my own home. Then Laura found something that made her stop. What? She turned the screen toward me. The person who had signed the agreement with the buyer wasn't Daniel. It was Patricia. As if she were the owner. I stared at the document. Then I saw the signature. It looked familiar. Too familiar. I looked at Laura. This is the same signature. She nodded. The same forged signature appears on multiple documents. And suddenly we had something, a pattern. Not one mistake, not one misunderstanding. A deliberate attempt to make my name appear on documents I had never signed. I called Officer Reynolds. He listened carefully. Then he said, do not confront them. I won't. Keep every document. I will. And don't let anyone into the house. I won't. Then he said, we may need to talk again. I hung up. For the first time since 2 a.m., I felt something other than fear. I felt prepared. 3 days later, Daniel asked to meet. I agreed. But I didn't meet him alone. Laura was there. So was my brother James. Daniel arrived with Patricia and Marcus. They sat across from me. For a few seconds nobody spoke. Then Patricia said, this has gone too far. I looked at her. You changed the locks on my house. You weren't being reasonable. You forged my signature. I did not. Laura placed copies of the documents on the table. Patricia stopped speaking. Daniel looked down. Marcus shifted in his chair. I turned toward Daniel. Did you know my mother was going to do this? He nodded. Yes. Did you know she would change the locks? Yes. Did you know the house was going to be sold? He hesitated. Yes. I looked at him. Then why are you acting like this is a misunderstanding? He started crying. Because I was scared. Off what? Losing everything. I said. You were willing to make me lose everything to save yourself. He looked down. Patricia interrupted. You should help him. I would have helped him. She stared. If he had told me the truth, silence. I continued. If Daniel had come to me and said, I'm in serious debt. I made terrible decisions. I need help. I would have sat beside him. Daniel looked at me. But you lied. His face collapsed. Patricia said, we were trying to protect the family. No. I shook my head. You were protecting Daniel from the consequences of his choices. Marcus finally spoke. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. He leaned forward. The business was going to collapse. It already had. We needed the money. So you took my house. Daniel is your husband. And I am the legal owner. He said nothing. Laura placed another document on the table. This is the proposed sale agreement. Patricia looked at it. Then Laura said, the buyer has already been notified that the seller's authority is disputed. Marcus looked angry. You contacted them. Wes, you had no right. Laura smiled. Actually, I did. Then she pulled out another paper. This is a notice preventing the property from being transferred while the dispute is investigated. Patricia's face went pale. The plan was collapsing. Then James spoke for the first time. You all came to her house at 2 in the morning, because you thought she wouldn't fight. Nobody answered. He continued. That was your mistake. I looked at Daniel. I don't want revenge. He looked surprised. I want accountability. The investigation took weeks. During that time, more information came out. The lender had not known the documents were false. The real estate company had believed Patricia had authority. The locksmith had been hired through a contractor. Nobody except the family had known what was really happening. That helped me, because the more people we spoke to, the clearer the pattern became. One email from Patricia was especially important. She had written, once Claire is out of the property, everything will be much easier. Another message from Marcus said, she'll eventually give up. She's always been too soft. I read that sentence several times. Too soft. That was what they thought of me. They had mistaken patience for weakness. They had mistaken kindness for surrender. They had no idea what I was capable of when I had something worth protecting. Then we found Daniel's financial records. The debt was real. But there was something else. He had lied about how much money he had lost. He hadn't simply made one bad investment. He had spent money on expensive purchases, trips, a new car, private memberships, loans to friends. Things he had hidden from me. He wasn't just trying to save a business. He was trying to protect a lifestyle. And my house was supposed to pay for it. That realization changed something inside me. I stopped feeling sorry for him. I could understand fear. I could understand mistakes. But repeated deception was a choice. Then came the final discovery. A hidden account. Daniel had transferred money into an account I knew nothing about. And some of that money had gone directly to Patricia. I looked at the records. Why would he send money to his mother? Laura said, that's what we're going to ask. When Patricia was questioned, she claimed it was repayment for family expenses. But the dates didn't match. The amounts didn't match. And then one transfer appeared. A large payment, made just 2 days before the forged property transfer. Laura looked at me. This may be the missing piece. What's the missing piece? Your mother-in-law may not have been helping Daniel. I stared at her. What do you mean? She may have been taking advantage of the situation. I couldn't believe it. How? Laura showed me the numbers. If the house sold for the planned amount, Daniel's debt would be paid. But there would still be a large amount left over. And that money was supposed to be divided. A portion to Daniel, a portion to Marcus, and a portion to Patricia. I stared at the screen. They weren't simply trying to save Daniel. They had planned to profit from my house. And suddenly, the question wasn't, how could they do this? It was, how long had they been planning it? The investigation eventually reached the point where Officer Reynolds returned. He asked to see me at the house. I opened the door. He looked around. Same house. I smiled. Still mine. He laughed. Then his expression became serious. We've reviewed the documents. What did you find? He looked at the file. Several things. He explained that the signatures were being examined. The dates were being checked. The digital records were being reviewed. And the people involved were being interviewed. Then he said, the first night I came here, I thought this was a family property dispute. I nodded. But it isn't. No. He looked at me. Someone appears to have created a series of false documents to make it look like you transferred ownership. I swallowed. Wes. And your husband knew about the plan? Yes. Officer Reynolds sighed. That's unfortunate. Then he smiled slightly. You know what I remember most about that night? What? When your brother, In-law handed me that folder. I smiled. He thought it proved he owned the house. The officer shook his head. He was very confident. Then he paused. And then I looked at your original deed. He smiled. His face changed. I laughed for the first time in weeks. That was the moment I realized something. The person who had been terrified at 2 a.m. was no longer the same woman. I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew the truth. I knew the documents, I knew my rights, and I knew I wasn't alone. Officer Reynolds looked at me. You're going to be okay. I nodded. I know. He added. But don't expect your marriage to survive this. I looked away. I already know. Because the truth was, my marriage had already ended. The paperwork just hadn't caught up yet. Daniel and I eventually separated. There was no dramatic screaming match, no broken furniture, no final explosion. Just a quiet realization that trust had disappeared. He apologized. Many times he said he loved me. I believed him, but love without honesty isn't enough. He asked me to forgive him. I told him, I can forgive you. He looked relieved. But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to stay. He nodded. That was the hardest conversation of my life. Because I hadn't stopped loving him. I had stopped trusting him. And sometimes those are two very different things. The divorce process took time. The house remained mine. The attempted sale was canceled. The debts were handled separately. And eventually, Daniel had to face the consequences of his financial choices. His family stopped talking to me. That was fine. I didn't need them to understand. I needed my peace back. Months later, I changed the locks again. This time I chose them myself. I stood outside the front door holding the new keys. For a moment I thought about that night. 2:07 a.m. the locksmith, the folder, Patricia's confidence, Marcus's smile, Daniel's betrayal. Then I looked at the key in my hand. And I smiled, because this time, nobody else had it. After the divorce, I changed more than the locks. I changed the way I lived. I stopped making decisions based on what would keep everyone else comfortable. I painted the kitchen. I replaced the old furniture. I planted flowers outside the front door. I turned the room where Daniel had kept his office into a small library. For the first time in years, the house felt peaceful. Not like a marriage. Not like a family battlefield. One afternoon, James came over. He looked around. Feels different. You happy? I smiled. Yes, he nodded. Then he asked, do you ever regret fighting? I thought about it. No. Even though you lost your marriage, I looked at him. I didn't lose my marriage because I fought. I paused. I lost it because my husband tried to take my house. James smiled. Fair point. We sat on the porch. The same porch where Patricia had once stood at 2 a.m. The same porch where Marcus had told me I didn't belong. Now there were flowers along the railing, a small table, 2 chairs, sunlight, peace, and I realized something. They had tried to make me feel like a stranger in my own home. But they had failed. Because a house is not just walls. Home is the place where you are allowed to feel safe. And that night, they had tried to take that feeling from me. They failed. People often ask me what I would do differently. The answer is simple. I would trust my instincts sooner. I would ask more questions. I would pay attention when someone tells me not to worry. And I would never confuse being married with giving someone ownership over my life. Daniel was my husband. That did not give him permission to take my property. Patricia was my mother-in-law. That did not give her permission to decide where I lived. Marcus was family. That did not give him permission to change my locks. Family can love you. Family can support you. But family can also betray you. And when that happens, you don't have to destroy them. You don't have to become cruel. You don't have to seek revenge. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stand your ground. Protect what belongs to you. Tell the truth. And let the truth do the rest. That night at 2 a.m., my husband's family thought they were locking me out of my own life. They thought I would panic. They thought I would beg. They thought I would disappear. Instead, I called the police. I showed the deed. I showed the evidence. And I waited. Because I knew one thing. The truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be documented. By the time the investigation was over, the forged documents had been exposed. The planned sale had collapsed. My house remained mine. My marriage ended. And the people who had been so confident that night were forced to answer questions they never expected. But the most satisfying moment wasn't seeing Patricia embarrassed. It wasn't seeing Marcus lose his confidence. It wasn't even seeing Daniel admit what he had done. It was standing at my front door months later, holding my own key, a simple little piece of metal. But to me, it meant everything. It meant nobody else could decide where I belonged. Nobody else could tell me that I had no right to my own home. Nobody else could use my kindness against me. And nobody could make me feel powerless again. Because that night taught me something I will never forget. People can try to take your home. They can try to take your money. They can try to take your trust. But they cannot take your strength unless you give it to them. So if you're ever in a situation where someone tells you that you're too weak to fight, remember my story. The woman they thought would quietly walk away was the same woman who stood at her front door at 2 a.m., called the police, gathered the evidence, and refused to surrender. And the officer's priceless expression that night. It wasn't because he was amused. It was because he had just realized that the people standing in front of him were not the owners of the house. They were standing on the wrong side of the truth. And that was the moment their entire plan began to fall apart. The house stayed mine. The truth came out, and I finally understood that protecting yourself isn't revenge. Sometimes it's simply justice. T.E. and